Alright, today we're solving trig equations. To solve trig equations, we're first going to have to make sure, if we're using the calculator, that we have to make sure we check our mode. Okay, you have to make sure that you know whether it's in degrees or whether you want your answers to be in radians. Step 2, just like in any equation, you're going to start by isolating that trig function, getting that trig function by itself. And since, especially if we're using a calculator, we only have sine, cosine, and tangent on our calculator, if we have a reciprocal function, we're going to change it to its reciprocal by finding the reciprocals. And we're going to do that whether we're using a calculator or not. Number 4, you're going to ignore the sine and use the inverse function to solve for the reference angle. So you're going to ignore the sine and then you're going to use the inverse because you're going to be finding the angle. And then number 5, you're going to place the angle in the correct quadrants according to the sign of that trig function, and then you're going to determine the angles. Now, a lot of times I switch 4 and 5. I don't always do it in exactly the same order, and sometimes you're not going to have to do step 3. Okay, sometimes you may not need to change it to reciprocal functions because they're already in sine, cosine, or tangent. Remember that you can stop this at any time if you need to copy down notes or look at or repeat it if you need to look at it again. So we're going to start first with an example with the calculator. So notice the directions. It says use your calculator to approximate the values of the angle that satisfy the equation. Round your answers to the nearest degree. Solve for angles between 0 and 360 degrees. So the first thing you have to do is make sure that your calculator is in the degree mode because they're telling you to use a calculator on this problem. We're starting with an easy one that's just already really isolated. The sine theta is already isolated, so I don't have to worry about that part. Now I'm going to go ahead and start by drawing my x and y axis, and if the sign is negative, which quadrants is that going to be in? Well, we've been doing this already, so we know that it's going to be in the 3rd quadrant and it's going to be in the 4th quadrant. And now we're going to solve for the reference angle, and since it's an angle, you need to use the inverse. So I'm going to do the theta equals the inverse sine, or the arc sine, so I'm going to put sine of -1, and then remember we're ignoring the sine, okay, because we already know which quadrants it could be in. So we're trying to find the reference angle. So I'm going to put 0.82 here. I'm ignoring the sine. And then I'm going to go and plug that in my calculator. Now since it's degrees, okay, I'm going to round it to the nearest whole degree. So I come up with 55 degrees. Now remember, this is the reference angle. Okay, so 55 degrees is the reference angle, and I want to put it in here in the 3rd quadrant. Okay, this is really not my theta, this is actually my alpha because it's my reference angle. So theta is going to be possibly more than one answer. So if I go here, remember I have to take 180 and add it to 55. So I'm going to take 180 and add 55 to it. And so one possible answer would be 235. So one answer for theta would be 235 degrees. And then I could be in the 4th quadrant, so if I was doing it in the 4th quadrant, I'd be going all the way around like this. And so this time, to find my answer, I'm going to do 360 and subtract the 55. And so the other possibility, so there's 2 answers, okay, or it could possibly be 305 degrees. So you're usually going to have more than one answer. So remember that this is really the alpha that you're solving for. It's your reference angle. Then you have to go over here to your little picture that we've been using already in order to figure out what the actual angles are. Now number 2, we do have to do something here because first of all it's not isolated. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both sides by 5. So I end up with the cotangent of theta equals 12/5. Now, can I leave it like that? Well, I don't have a cotangent button on my calculator, so I'm going to have to do the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of cotangent is what? The tangent of theta. But if I've taken the reciprocal of the left side of the equation, then I must also take the reciprocal of the right side of the equation. So I'm going to do the reciprocal, and I'm going to get 5/12. And so now, since it's the angle that I'm trying to find, I'm going to have to realize that since the tangent is positive, in which quadrants could it be in? It could be in the first quadrant or the third quadrant. So I'm going to do the inverse. So to find my alpha, I'm going to do the inverse tangent of 5/12 and plug that in my calculator. Second tangent of 5/12, and I get the answer to be 23 degrees. And so again, I know that since this is in the first quadrant, that theta could possibly be the same thing as alpha, so it's going to be 23 degrees. Or it could be in this quadrant, so remember, if I'm starting here and going over here to the third quadrant, I'm going to end up taking 180, and I'm going to be adding 23 to it. And so it could also be 203. So again, notice that you have two answers. So this one is a little bit longer because you have to first get that cotangent isolated, then you have to take the reciprocal of both sides, and then you find your alpha and figure out what the two answers are because you have two different quadrants. Okay, the next one, again, it's not isolated, so I'm going to start by subtracting 9 from each side. And I get 3 cosine of theta equals -2. Now I'm going to divide by 3. So I get the cosine of theta is equal to -2/3. So since the cosine is negative, I know it has to be in the, can't be in the first or the last quadrant, so it must be in the second or the third quadrant. So I'm going to again find my alpha. Remember that it's the inverse, so I'm going to do the cosine inverse or the arc cosine. And remember to ignore the sign, because I'm taking care of the sign when I'm putting down here that it's in this quadrant or that it's in this quadrant. So I'm going to put that in my calculator. So second cosine of 2/3, and I find that it is 48 degrees. So remember, that's my alpha because that's my reference angle. So to actually find my theta now, I've got to go to the second quadrant. So if my reference angle here is 48, I've got to do 180 degrees minus 48, and I'm going to get 132 degrees. Or it might be in the third quadrant, and so to get that answer, I'm going to take 180 degrees plus the 48 degrees. So it could also possibly be 228 degrees. Now this time we're going to do this without a calculator. So notice that the next direction says find all the values that satisfy the equation for 0 to 360 degrees. Do not use a calculator. So it's still the first step to start with. I'm going to go ahead and solve. So I'm going to get the trig function by itself. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. And I get 4 cosine squared of theta equals 3. Then I'm going to divide by 4. And then I'm going to get cosine squared of theta equals 3/4. Then I want to get rid of this squared, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So the cosine of theta is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 3/4. And so I have to realize that if it's plus or minus the cosine, it can be in what quadrant? It can be in all 4, right? So it can actually be in 4. So I'm going to have 4 answers to this one because of the plus or minus. Now, since I can't use a calculator, I'm going to figure out my reference angle by drawing myself a triangle. And so if this is my reference angle here, I know that over here is my opposite, here is my adjacent, and here is my hypotenuse. And I need to simplify this, so I'm going to get plus or minus. Remember, we're going to ignore the sign anyway. Square root of 3 I can't simplify, so I'm going to leave it as square root of 3. But when I take the square root of 4 from the denominator, I'm going to get 2. Now what I want you to do on these problems is I want you to always try to do it without the calculator first, and then if you can't do it without a calculator, sometimes it'll be obvious. But if you can do it without a calculator, when we do the scavenger hunt, I want you to actually do the scavenger hunt first. Try to do it with without your calculator. And notice I'm going to label this, since it's the cosine, this is the adjacent. So the adjacent is going to be square root of 3. And then this is the hypotenuse is 2. And then it's like, well, what does that look like? Which one of our triangles is that? Well, this is our 30. So my alpha is 30 degrees. And then I have to go put it in all 4 quadrants. So theta could possibly be 30 degrees or 180 minus 30. So it could also be 150 degrees or 180 plus 30 degrees. So it could be 210. Or to get the last one, I'm going to do 360 minus 30, so it could be 330. So this is how we can solve trig equations with and without a calculator.